Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're watching and listening. This special infrastructure intelligence panel debate on the issue of planning, and specifically how can the planning system help deliver the government's build infrastructure agenda on the day that the government have actually announced its planning for the future consultation. Some would call it an overhaul of the planning system in the UK. What we're trying to do and what we want to do today on this discussion is to explore current planning challenges with a very knowledgeable panel on these particular issues. And we want to explore these challenges in the light of the issues that face the infrastructure and construction sector, particularly with a view to looking at the various infrastructure planning regimes, including the national policy statements in the light of things like the Heathrow Judicial Review and other emerging issues, and also to discuss how those national policy statements maybe need to evolve somewhat in order to satisfy the government's wider ambitions in relation to infrastructure development. As I say, we have a very knowledgeable panel with us today. Which includes Daniel Moylan, a former Deputy Chairman of Transport for London, Sean Spears, the Chief Executive of the Green Alliance, Robbie Owen, Head of Infrastructure Planning and Government Affairs at Pinsent Masons, and Hannah Vickers, the Chief Executive of the Association for Consultancy and Engineering. Just a quick word on how things are going to work during the course of the discussion and the debate. Daniel is going to give an introduction and maybe set out some of the challenges that face both government and the industry in relation to these very important planning issues. And then Robbie, Sean and Hannah will speak in turn with their take on this very important issue. So without further ado, we'll get to our first speaker, and that is Daniel Moylan. As I said earlier, Daniel is a former Deputy Chairman of Transport for London under the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. He's also a former non-executive director of Crossrail Limited and a former deputy leader of Kensington and Chelsea Council. Daniel is currently working with a major London landowner to develop a project for a new privately funded railway in the capital. He also chairs Urban Design London, which is a public-private sector network dedicated to improving the skills of professionals working on urban design and the built environment. So Daniel, if you can outline the challenges around this whole issue of planning and how it's going to facilitate the delivery of the infrastructure agenda. Daniel, over to you.
Andy, thank you very much. And as you rightly said, today is the day that the government has launched its consultation on its new planning regime. And much of that, of course, rightly relates to the pressing need for the more rapid delivery of homes and new buildings and the adaptations our cities need at a time of unprecedented and unpredictable transformation, in part provoked by the COVID pandemic. But the infrastructure that lies under the skin of our society must not be forgotten. And the purpose of this webinar, as you say, is to examine what needs to be done to ensure that infrastructure delivery happens at a pace and scale needed to match the government's stated ambitions. And crucial to that is certainty. Developers and promoters in public and private sector alike need certainty in three things: policy support, time, and the ability to react to market and commercial changes. And certainty, I'm happy to redefine certainty as the absence or the minimization of risk, because that's the other side of uncertainty is risk. There is too much risk in the system at the moment, and it needs to be brought down. Now, the Planning Act of 2008, which was a landmark piece of legislation, attempted to provide these certainties for nationally significant infrastructure projects. And while the system put in place then has generally worked well, it is definitely showing its age. For example, national policy statements are one of the key initiatives of that Planning Act, and they come forward as a way of demonstrating that different types of nationally significant infrastructure projects have policy support and that they are needed. And they were aimed at ensuring that developers and promoters have the certainty of policy support when they applied for consent for individual schemes and projects that would be granted under a development consent order. which in turn meant that the DCO examiners could focus on whether the impacts of individual projects were acceptable rather than on the question of basic need. However, many of those national policy statements are now old. After the initial burst of activity in 2008 to 2014, they're showing their age and creaking at the seams. For example, the energy NPSs do not account for solar or battery energy, or indeed the move to net zero. This has led to a situation, for example, where solar farms have to spend time and money arguing that they are needed when seeking to obtain consent, as they cannot rely on the NPSs. And in addition, the NPSs, the energy NPSs in particular, are now being challenged through judicial review. So there are three aspects of the regime that have chipped away at the certainty of the statutory timescales given within the Planning Act 2008. I'm just going to dwell on those three things. The first is stakeholder resourcing. The budgets of the statutory agencies that have to comment on and contribute to DCO applications, such as Natural England, the Environment Agency, Historic England, the MMO, and local authorities, those budgets have been cut or reallocated to such an extent that many of them are unable to retain sufficient expertise and resource dealing with the consultations. This means that outstanding issues are unable to be resolved in good time, with recent trends leading to key matters not being able to be resolved during examination. This leads to the Secretary of State having to undertake post-examination consultations, often leading to extensions of the supposedly fixed decision-making period. And the recent spate of minded to decisions, Secretary of State letters. The Secretary of State often gets very cross with everybody about all of this and exhorts them to do better at resolving the issues. But without adequate resourcing, this will continue to be difficult for the statutory bodies. Judicial review. I wrote a paper myself recently on the judicial review of the airport's national policy statement on which the Heathrow third runway is predicated. And it's generally true to say that the threat of judicial reviews of DCOs has grown, even if their success has remained low. But the delay involved in getting the whole thing sorted, going to the High Court, going then potentially to the Court of Appeal and possibly to the Supreme Court, adds the whole shooting match, adds at least a year to the process. Time is money and delay really matters. And of course, every time you go to one of these courts, you are uncertain, you enter another period of uncertainty and risk as to what the outcome of that judicial decision is going to be. And the Heathrow case, the recent airport's national policy statement, really illustrated the difficulties this poses for private companies. Heathrow is a private company, and it invested its own money, some of it was its own money, in developing this project, and then found that the rug was pulled from under it by the Court of Appeal because of a decision, or a flawed decision as they took the view, a small element in the process made by the Department for Transport, something that the airport had no control or say over, but it's their money and their project which is being put at risk in this very unpredictable way. And in case you think I'm an advocate for Heathrow Airport, I'm not. I've actually campaigned against the third runway, but the way in which they're being treated shows how very difficult I think it is, and then expensive, to get private capital involved in infrastructure development because of these unnecessary levels of risk. Decision making is a third element. Some delays to Secretary of State decision making have simply occurred because the government hasn't got a move on. I could give a list of these, but if this national significant infrastructure project regime is to be able to be relied on, the government has to play its part and they have to make good decisions on time. And this is not just an issue with them. It also, with government, it also occurs at local authority level, and there is no clear statutory timetable for decisions being made at local or regional level either. And finally, the point I want to make is about flexibility. The DCO process is very heavily front-loaded, and the permission that one gets at the end of a DCO is very detailed. And that is absolutely fine in a sense, because it removes a lot of uncertainty from what it is you are able to build. But of course, as you set about building, and as the passage of time progresses, and remember it takes several years normally to get to this point, techniques, methodologies, new discoveries as you approach and assess the site all come to the fore that allow you, if you had a free hand, would allow you to deliver the project more efficiently, more cheaply, more effectively, and in a shorter space of time. But there is a constant battle for developers and promoters to get permission to do this because of the rigidity and detail of the development consent order they've achieved is not easily amended without going through the process again. So perhaps there needs to be something done to address that as well. So I've set out a series of challenges there, Andy, which I think the government really needs to grapple with if they want to deliver infrastructure at the pace that the Prime Minister is so clearly committed to. And I don't think these are going to go away. I think they're going to have to face up to them. And we can make a contribution in the course of this webinar, to some of the solutions to that. So over to you now, Andy, to take it forward.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Daniel. I'm sure we will return to some of those points that you've raised during the discussion. Next up is Sean Spears, who is the Executive Director of the Green Alliance, an environmental lobby group, I think it's fair to say, that work very closely with business in order to advocate and argue for a more greener and a prosperous UK. Sean was previously an MEP for the South East, and he also served on the European Parliament's Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee. He was also Chief Executive of the CPRE, the Campaign to Protect Rural England, in the past as well. So Sean, and I'll just correct your title, of course, Chief Executive of the Green Alliance. Over to you, Sean.
Great, thanks, Andy. I just want to correct you on one thing. Green Alliance is much more high-minded than a mere lobby group. We're a think tank, and we liaise and coordinate a lot of the other environmental groups. I was very interested in Daniel's comments about certainty, and you know, certainly from my time at CPRE, there was certainty works or uncertainty works on both sides. It's very frustrating for developers. It's very frustrating for community groups, and communities often see or think they see developers gaming the system, particularly on housing land supply. So certainty is desirable on all sides, I think, but extremely hard to achieve. And I also welcome what Daniel said about stakeholder resourcing. I think the Natural England, the Environment Agency, local authorities, massively underfunded. There's been quite a lot of focus recently on the sort of virtual disappearance of local authority ecologists, for instance. Local authorities being expected to put a lot of effort into how to achieve net gain for nature through the Environment Bill. There's nobody who can take those decisions. And finally, on Daniel's comments, I also very much agree that delay is often political. Sometimes it's politicians dodging decisions. If national planning statements or policy statements are out of date, get on and make them up to date. Don't blame planning for them being out of date. And likewise, if difficult decisions stay a long time on a minister's desk, that is not the fault of planning. That's because they're very political and contentious, and the government is possibly avoiding making difficult decisions. And that applies to governments of all stripes, of course. Now, the exam question, if you like, was about the build agenda, and I just want to set the context from a green point of view, which is that we have an extremely stretching target of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and we are massively off target. And we are off target indeed to achieve the 4th and 5th carbon budgets, which were based on 80% reduction in emissions, not net zero. So we need to look at infrastructure, and a lot of the infrastructure we're planning to build at the moment is high carbon and is baking failure into the system. So, for instance, there is a budget. We spent £11 billion on high carbon transport infrastructure since 2017. There's a plan for building 4,000 miles of new roads to 2025. That's £24.7 billion in the budget. There is we spent £9 billion on building homes since 2017, homes that we will have to retrofit because they're not zero carbon compliant. The new policy white paper out, the planning white paper out today, says that in future homes will be built in a way that can be converted to become net zero compliant. But that's not happening yet. £1.6 billion this year spent on housing which will have to be retrofitted. Only 1.2% of new homes built in England and Wales are at energy band certificate A. So we are baking failure into the system, and Green Alliance's research shows that there's something like a £14 billion annual gap in the infrastructure we need to be net zero compliant. And I think the lockdown and the impact of coronavirus should give us pause for thinking on some of those major infrastructure projects, particularly new roads, as we've all been doing loads and loads of Zoom calls and struggling with poor broadband, etc. Do we really need to be investing all that money in roads at a time when public finances are extremely strained, or should we be looking instead to invest in green infrastructure such as new broadband? So we need the infrastructure to deliver our net zero aspirations. We also need to think about green infrastructure, because alongside catastrophic climate change, which is baked into the system and we need to do something about, not least as hosts of the UN climate talks COP26 in Glasgow next year, alongside that we've got a catastrophic decline in nature both across the world and in the UK, and we need to set aside, we think, something like a third of the land for high quality nature. We need to think about kind of nature alongside build. And the Prime Minister's framing of the build proposition in his speech at the end of June, where he talked about newt counting delays in the system, holding back productivity, etc., was extremely unfortunate, because it was a sort of coded attack on the European Habitats and Birds directives, the strategic environmental assessment, etc., that has done a huge amount to protect nature in this country and across the European Union. George Eustace has rowed back from some of that. We're expecting a consultation in the autumn. The government's language has become much more emollient, and I know that the Prime Minister is probably incapable of thinking of newts without thinking about Gussie Fink-Nottle and P.G. Woodhouse, and I guess it was just a joke, but it was interpreted as being an attack on the nature protection that we need. So there's a really big question about what we build, as well as how to make it easier to build, and how to ensure that we don't bake in failure and bake in catastrophic climate change and the decline of nature. There's also a question of consent and the extent to which consent can be achieved through a perfect planning system. And I think you have to be skeptical about this. If you look at a major infrastructure project like HS2, which by the way, CPRE was pretty supportive of, and I was pretty supportive of it. And I certainly believe we need a new high-speed line, and let's do it as well as we can. But the opposition to HS2 all along the route isn't because of planning; it's because people don't want major infrastructure in their backyard, and that's something no planning system is going to get round. There were lots of planning battles about Heathrow, but the more recent battle has been on the Climate Change Act. It's not a planning question; it's whether the third runway is compatible with the government's legally binding commitments on climate change. There's also a planning case going through the courts now on the government's roads programme, whether that's compatible with the government's climate change commitments. And again, that's not strictly a planning issue. That's to do with the Climate Change Act. So I sometimes think planning is sort of used as a proxy for what are wider political battles, and you won't. And my concern actually about the planning white paper that's just been released and about the Prime Minister's and the Community Secretary's introductions to it is the sort of sense one gets that you can make a complex and deeply political process simple and uncomplicated by changing the words and by a stroke of the pen. And that is pretty well how Greg Clark came in with the National Planning Policy Framework 8 years ago. He was going to simplify everything, but you can't simplify complex decisions that have a huge impact on places that people care about. They are intensely political, and they need to be brought out in a kind of political arena. So I'll end there, but I look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you very much, Sean. Some very interesting points there, including the restating, the fact that CPRE were in favour of HS2, because I think sometimes the debate on this issue can actually get a little bit overly tribal, shall I say, and there are complicated issues that people need to address, not the least of which is sometimes politicians hiding behind legislation, really, when they have the power to actually change it. But we'll come on to that.
Sorry, Andy, I should just sorry to butt in, but I should just say that although that was the position of the national CPRE, I was a hate figure in CPRE Warwickshire, CPRE Buckinghamshire, some of the other branches. But nationally, we said we do need to increase capacity on the railways, and that will require a new line.
As I said, it's a complicated issue, a multifaceted issue, and one that deserves more discussion. Clearly, anyway, our next speaker is Robbie Owen, and Robbie is the head of infrastructure planning and government affairs at the legal firm Pinsent Masons. He spent a 30-year career working on the planning and consenting aspects of large infrastructure projects, and he was closely involved in setting up the national infrastructure planning regime in 2008. He also founded in 2010 the National Infrastructure Planning Association. For those that aren't aware of that organisation's work, do look them up, because they are involved in some really interesting stuff. He's also a Role A parliamentary agent, one of a small band of practicing lawyers authorised by Westminster to act as an agent for those promoting and opposing private and hybrid bills in Parliament. So he's ideally placed to talk to us on this issue of planning and how do we make it so the infrastructure plans of the government are facilitated by a better planning system. Over to you, Robbie.
Well, thank you, Andy, and good afternoon, everybody. Just by way of responding to what Sean said, I do entirely agree that planning is often used as a proxy for wider political battles. Those are the words Sean used, and I think we see that all the time. And when people talk about planning, they mean a whole variety of systems and processes. I wanted to make 5 points, really, just by way of opening in terms of my contribution. The first is the absolutely crucial role that policy support does play when you're at the coalface of trying to get permission for a major energy, transport, water infrastructure scheme, which is what I spend my day job doing. And the whole point of the Planning Act process was to put in place, in advance of individual schemes being brought forward, a firm, clear national policy context to avoid arguing about policy and need for the individual project at the later stage when it's brought forward for consideration and permission. And the system that we now have has been pretty successful since 2010, when it started operating, in providing that firm policy backdrop for projects in this suite of national policy statements, which have a legal significance and have to be taken into account and are the guiding policy statement when it comes to government deciding whether to give a particular project consent or not. And the position, however, is slowly eroding, and it's extremely worrying to those of us who are trying to get permission for projects, when actually increasingly the policy backdrop is getting older and older. As Daniel mentioned, decisions made relying on that policy backdrop are now being challenged in court, and therefore I think it's absolutely critical, and I use that word intentionally, absolutely critical that government gets a real grip on this, and as part of its work on the National Infrastructure Strategy this autumn, following the National Infrastructure Commission's National Assessment that it really gets the grip on and completely modernises the suite of national policy statements we have. And my own proposal, as published in Infrastructure Intelligence earlier this week, was that government should put in place a super NPS that brings all of the current NPSs together, uses the opportunity to tackle important issues like net zero and the green agenda and how we're going to build back better and greener, and does this within 12 months of the national infrastructure strategy coming in this autumn, because otherwise we're going to get into deep trouble. And yeah, the planning system so far for national infrastructure has given consent to about 90 projects since 2010, but increasingly I sense the wheels are slowing and may soon begin to get very wobbly, if not fall off, unless government and ministers really get a grip on this and understand the critical importance of national policy statements when at the coalface of getting permission for individual projects. Secondly, in terms of stakeholders, and let's not forget the Chancellor's Project Speed initiative, having properly resourced stakeholders at all stages of the infrastructure planning process is critical. Natural England, Marine Management Organisation, Historic England, Highways England, Environment Agency, and there are others, are all facing huge demands, increasingly so now post-COVID-19, and it's completely important and critical that they are properly resourced to deal with developers coming forward with national infrastructure projects and engage with them and are able to engage with them from the very early stages, because that will help to improve those projects, but also help to speed up the process. And we time and time again see delays encountered because, through no fault of their own, these national agencies who have very important areas to cover are just not able to respond. They aren't able to retain the right staff because they just don't have the resources. And this is something government could fix quickly. It doesn't require legislation, doesn't require policy change, just requires a bit of extra money from HM Treasury. And I really would urge government to look at the resourcing of key stakeholders who are vitally important to the infrastructure planning regime. Thirdly, in terms of decision making, completely agree that we've got to have another look at this, because when the new regime came in for national infrastructure projects in 2010, it did include for the first time a statutory timescale for ministers to take decisions, and the first 65 or so of those were all made on time, and that's hugely important to project promoters and communities to know what the timescale is. But slowly since then, over the last 3 or 4 years, timescales have been eroded, and this really does matter. And I think ministers need to remind themselves of the importance of making decisions within statutory timescales wherever possible. There will always be some exceptions like general elections, but otherwise there really should be no excuse. And helping to resource stakeholders, my last point, helps to front load issues so they don't then become issues during the decision making phase. So proper decision making in terms of those adhering to the statutory timescales, and looking at those infrastructure planning regimes where there aren't any timescales, for example under highways legislation or railways legislation, government should consider whether those should also be imposed, because they have worked well on the whole under the Planning Act regime since 2010. The fourth point I wanted to make was in terms of the just looking at the scope and working of the infrastructure planning regime, because it could do with a refresh. The National Infrastructure Planning Association, NIPA, produced a survey report last week on this subject with some ideas for government to consider areas for reform. And indeed, in today's consultation paper, which was rightly and inevitably focused on housing, there is a question 9C, on new settlements, asking whether there's a case for new settlements to be allowed to be brought forward under the national infrastructure planning regime. And the benefit of that, in my view, and I think there absolutely is a case for that, is that you could then deal with large new community schemes at the same time as the infrastructure they need to work and to be acceptable in a fast track way, but which is done against a clear backdrop of national policy. And again, I come back to the first point, which is this would only work for new settlements if there was very clear national policy against which to judge individual schemes. So government, I think, needs to look at some of the workings of the regime. Flexibility is an issue as part of that, because there's no doubt that some of the consents given are not as flexible as they could be and could acceptably be, in my view. And also, I think as part of that, we need to look at assessments. I entirely agree with what Sean said, but there's no doubt the current myriad of assessments environmental impact assessment, habitat regulations assessment, water framework directive assessment, health impact assessment, etc., etc. They surely could be perhaps merged together to again help to speed up the pre-application process, to help reduce burdens on consultees if they're just having to respond to one assessment, not 4 or 5. That must surely be a good thing as long as the assessment is still doing what it needs to do. So I think looking at scope and workings of the infrastructure planning regime is important as a refresh after 10 years. And finally, just on delivery. Delivery, of course, is vital, and I think an area that government is working on, but I would encourage it to accelerate, is reforming the abilities we have for development corporations. We had in the budget in March mention of some proposed new development corporations, and we have areas of the country, particularly Midlands Engine, who have been putting forward plans for a locally led urban development corporation as opposed to the centrally run development corporations we have at the moment in legislation. So I think government needs to look at reforming the system of development corporations, because there's no doubt that they do have an important part to play in delivering infrastructure and development such as new settlements. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robbie. Really important point you raised there. Well, you raised a number of important points, but an extremely important point at the end there about the regional aspects as well. And maybe we might have some time to explore some of the devolution issues as well going forward, because I think they're very germane to this particular subject. Our final panelist is Hannah Vickers. Hannah is the Chief Executive of ACE, which is the Association for Consultancy and Engineering, whose members play a critical role in the development of the UK's infrastructure. Hannah has wide experience within the sector, including previous roles with the ICE in a senior policy role, and also Hannah knows the inner workings, I think it's fair to say, of government, having worked with the Treasury in the past on the development of infrastructure projects. Hannah, over to you for your thoughts.
Thank you, Andy. You managed to simultaneously tie me with the big bad business and government brush there, so I'm going to be supremely popular with your listeners. That was brilliant. Thank you. So yeah, just to kick off, I think if I were to respond, take myself back to my government days when I was in the Treasury, I think it would be an interesting exercise, Robbie, to take your observations on the performance of the NPS and overlay the political environment, because my immediate reaction to that would be the performance of politicians, or lack of performance, that we've seen recently may be directly correlated to the fact that they were in a very fragile government setup, you know, slim majorities, constant elections, and a big problem like Brexit that nobody really had an answer to. So I suspect there is some element of that, but perhaps that gives us cause for hope looking forward, when actually we are in a place now where they've got a decent majority. It does bring us, again, if I start my piece here, is going to be very much through the lens of business, and in part through my work on the Construction Leadership Council. So, you know, drawing heavily on that in terms of the business perspective and the business context that we find ourselves in at the moment. As you say, we've had the build agenda, which is faster, greener, better, social, and that's what I keep trying to add on to the end, because actually it's in no one's interest to just build for the sake of it. I think we do need to keep reminding our government about that. But actually, once you add on faster, better, greener, that is a fundamentally different set of proposals. That is a fundamentally different infrastructure strategy and pipeline that we would be looking at in order to meet that, not just the net zero target, but actually better in the lens of a post-COVID world. It's probably very different to a lot of what we have in the pipeline at the moment. So I think, you know, that is really important for us to be cognizant of. And I'll come back to that when I come to my closing remarks around where we go from here, because I don't think we should lose sight of that. That actually, if planning is the process of how we deliver, I think we've got some very big questions to answer on what, which maybe touches, Robbie, on your point around the super national policy statement, which I really like as an idea. I think that's fantastic, and yeah, just the sort of thing from a, you know, again, shallow political point of view that I could see sounds revolutionary enough for our government or our current administration to go for. So if I just bring in a little bit of industry context to this, I think, you know, perhaps very timely because of where we are. If we were in a settled situation, we hadn't had COVID, I think, you know, you could sort of say, actually, for the greater good, we focus on the what and the how and the processes. But it's going to be brought very quickly home to us that, you know, there are some sort of short-term, our hair is on fire challenges that are going to at least need to be supported by our sort of approach to the NPSs and to the reforming the planning process. The first one of which is employment. So, you know, we know through the Construction Leadership Council, we've got about 690,000 jobs at risk this year in construction. Now that's a huge amount. You know, some of it has been very obvious because of the pause in construction activity. Others is because of that lack of confidence that Daniel talked about, and I will return to that because that is the single biggest underlying issue for businesses, be they clients, be they private sector investors, or on the other side, actually my members and the wider construction industry involved in delivering this. So, you know, we've got that many jobs at risk. But if I turn that on its head, actually, if we're able to rebuild confidence, we're one of the few sectors that can get people into employment quickly. And we know that there is long-term demand there. It might just be different demands to what we've planned for previously. So, you know, can we turn that 690,000 figure into a positive from being a negative and actually redeploy people from other sectors? So there's huge opportunity there if we get this right. Secondly, in terms of the industry context, is not to lose sight of the capability development that is attached to these programmes. You know, we very easily, particularly when we start to talk about the planning process, get hung up on the fact that High Speed 2 is going to impact people. It's going to, you know, go through people's gardens. It's going to have a very direct impact on certain landowners. But actually, through doing it, it's more than just a railway scheme. It's about developing capability for the next 10 to 15 years, which is something that we won't get if we don't invest in the infrastructure and have that strong pipeline of activity. And lastly, again, perhaps relevant to what the government might be thinking around COVID recovery is innovation. You know, it's another one of sort of Boris's buzzwords, if you like, that he sees as the route out of COVID. Is making, you know, Britain a global power, is investing in innovation and technology. And again, infrastructure, if we have that long-term certainty and that confidence provided by a decent NPS, a decent planning system, it is something which can really act as a catalyst in that space. So, you know, I think we're looking at something here where we're zooming in, and I know why we're zooming in because that's the topic that we're looking at today, but we do need to be mindful that it's more than just development. It's more than, you know, we are arguing for employment, for skills, for capacity, and maybe for exports and the sort of longer term prosperity of the economy, rather than just thinking actually this is about individual projects. So just to conclude, I wanted to reiterate really the need. And all of those good things I've spoken about will only come to fruition if we have confidence in the pipeline from the businesses. And to touch on some of what my fellow speakers have spoken about, planning is a key component in that, but it is only part of the process. So we need to think about it. There is more that could be done. Through the CRC, we're very interested in the idea of a statutory charter for the, you know, for the planning process to ensure that, albeit we may not have as fast as we like schemes coming through, we at least have certainty about how long they're going to take, which, you know, interestingly, in engagement with my members, certainty in some cases, well, in a lot of cases, is more valuable than faster. So if we know, and actually that's what they need to turn it around, but we have got that certainty that that is when we will get a decision, is probably more valuable than project speed and trying to do it at 100 miles an hour. So that's a key component of building confidence. We've talked about the National Infrastructure Strategy. That should set the strategic direction. I think that is critical to us understanding the what and setting a clear direction on the what that we need to meet these changing demands. I would question, and perhaps there's something we can pick up in the debate, whether we have enough certainty to write that yet. I think COVID has thrown a lot of that up in the air. I do fear for a National Infrastructure Strategy that is published in the autumn, that actually it may become a white elephant and we end up pursuing things that are no longer relevant to society, which in itself undermines the confidence of the investors and the businesses. So maybe that's when, Robbie, we can pick up with how that interfaces with your super NPS. I'd be interested in exploring that. And then lastly, the commercials of this. Daniel mentioned this in his introduction, but business confidence is critical to unlocking the commercials, whether that is foreign direct investment into our infrastructure, whether that is investment by the businesses in recruiting, retraining, upskilling their people. All of that will only happen if we have that sort of long-term certainty. So again, I wouldn't underestimate the importance of that. And again, if we hark back to or look at the wider context, that we're not going to be in a position where our government is awash with government funding to keep propping us up, actually, as an economy, as businesses, as individuals in employment. We're very quickly going to need to start to draw down and leverage that private sector investment. So as far as possible, we need to make that an attractive commercial environment for those investors. Needless to say, there's hopefully a lot we can get onto in terms of the debate around that. I'm really excited by this. I said we've got a huge opportunity coming up through the Construction Leadership Council and our ability to be able to feed in and influence government. So I really look forward to hearing some practical solutions to those challenges. As a non-planning expert here, it's really, really interesting and excited to be part of the debate.
Thanks very much, Hannah. We're going to get straight into the discussion because we do have limited time. But one thing that's coming through to me, listening to all of you speak, and that is this question of certainty. Everyone's raised it in a different aspect. And how do we actually get to that situation where there is certainty, both in terms of planners and developers who are looking at basically developing infrastructure, and also for the people who are actually going to deliver it, the Hannah's members at the other end, if you like. How do we get to that point? Because it seems, and I think, Robbie, this is something you spoke about in your recent article in Infrastructure Intelligence. You said some of these issues have been put on the too difficult to deal with pile. So maybe if I come to you first, how do we actually cut through everything and get some real certainty in order to deliver what we need to deliver? Robbie. In fact, I'll ask Daniel of that, because for some reason Robbie can't hear us. Daniel, how do you think we can basically engender that certainty so that we can actually do what's needed to be done?
Well, I personally think that the range of challenges that are now coming forward to both NPSs and DCO decisions bring into question, my view is it actually brings into question whether the Planning Act 2008 can be fixed. I mean, there are two ways of approaching this. If we take it for granted that the Planning Act 2008 gave a satisfactory framework when it was first put in place, are the problems, as Robbie would suggest, I think, fixable, that we just need to get back to the halcyon days of 2008 and the period immediately following it? Or are we now in a position where we need to scrap that and think of a different approach? And there are, of course, other approaches. So traditionally, projects such as the sort we're discussing would have been dealt with through hybrid acts of parliament. Smaller ones through Transport and Works Act orders. Those still exist. And of course, HS2 is proceeding on the basis of a hybrid act of parliament, and Crossrail is stuttering its way to completion on the basis of a hybrid act of parliament. So those options are not ruled out, they still exist. It may be that, and you will get a higher level of certainty with an act of parliament because the act itself is not challengeable in the courts. And to that extent, it may be that MPs have to put their shoulder to the wheel more in legislative terms. They don't like, MPs don't like hybrid acts of parliament because they get locked in committees for weeks and weeks on end, listening to people complaining about how something's going to affect their back garden and so forth. And it's not really what they feel, perhaps, that it's not quite the global stage on which they feel it's their destiny to stride. But maybe that is what they will have to learn to do if the government is to achieve the sort of agenda it wants with a higher level of certainty. So there's a good question in my mind about whether the Planning Act can be fixed. I'll come to something else, which will probably, Stephen has just vanished off my screen. I hope you can hear this. Something else is, I do not think as we leave the European Union that we can afford to regard European Union environmental legislation as fixed. It is a huge burden on development, and much of it is a large-scale tick box exercise. And I take the Habitats Directive as quite a good example of that. And of course, it's all very well for Stephen to say it's protecting nature. A lot of it is protecting nature which we have manufactured. When we were discussing the possibility of an airport in the estuary, there were people who said, oh, you mustn't disturb nature in the estuary. Well, there is almost no nature in the estuary. There's almost nothing in the estuary that we haven't actually built over the last 200 years. And that includes where the water flows, it includes the land masses, it includes the islands we have created and the islands we have eliminated through moving water around them, and great shelves that have been built out, channels that have been carved for ships to pass through the estuary, channels that have been carved by us. There's very little indeed that's natural there at all. So I think it's too easy to get hooked up on the idea that there is this untouched nature out there that somehow needs preserving. There are examples of it, but there are places where, in fact, we are living in an entirely man-made environment, and we need just to question what our commitment to that is. So that's my little challenge to Stephen. But I think legislation and legal procedures need to be looked at, but I also think we need to be aware that some of the burdens we have put on ourselves over the last few years are genuinely holding things up.
Thanks, Daniel. I just want to bring Sean back in on those, not on all of those issues.
I meant Sean. I beg your pardon. I said Stephen several times, and I meant Sean. I do beg your pardon.
That's fine. I'm not expecting you to answer all of those points, Sean, because we simply don't have time. But you talked about certainty when you spoke earlier as well for communities. But maybe some reflections on what Daniel's just said.
Well, I think it's rather worrying. I remember Martin Doughty, the first chair of Natural England, saying that he had briefly advocated that Natural England should be called semi-natural England, acknowledging the points that Daniel's made. I mean, we're a busy, industrialised, heavily populated country, but we're also a massively nature-depleted country, one of the most nature-depleted countries in Europe, and with nature declining at a catastrophic rate. And all the evidence is that you can't tackle climate change without also tackling nature's decline, and vice versa. And these things are an existential risk to us all, including business. So I think you've got to take it seriously. That doesn't mean dying in a ditch for every single way in which the European Union has carried out its nature protection. The EU has had a very positive impact on nature protection in the UK, and there's lots of nature in the UK that probably wouldn't exist but for the Habitats Directive, strategic environmental impact, etc., etc. But of course, the challenge now is, can we do things better, that we can draw up our own rules? The last thing I'd say on certainty is that we hear sort of emollient words from George Eustace. He gave a speech to Green Alliance the other week saying, yes, this is all about doing things better and having more nature, etc. And if we really believe that, if we believe that's where the government was coming from, then you would get less knee-jerk community and environmental NGO resistance and more of a constructive dialogue. But the mood music coming from government is too uncertain. So you get the kind of good mood music. This is all about faster, greener, better. And then you get the newt counting delays and the planning bashing and the community bashing. And that's why you end up with a kind of unhealthy battle over development all the time. Because it kind of matters to people. It's where people do care about places.
Thanks, Sean. Robbie, you spoke quite a lot about certainty. What do you think specifically the government ought to be doing, and how do we address this whole area?
Well, I think, Andy, it goes back to the points I was making, because I think each of them would make a major contribution to achieving that certainty, or regaining the certainty that I think we had until a couple of years ago, and getting that confidence in the pipeline that Hannah talked about. So having really clear national policy statements against which individual schemes are judged is vital. being very clear about decision-making timescales is vital, and having properly resourced stakeholders to contribute to the development and assessment of these individual projects, that is vital as well. So I think government looking at those points, not all of which require a change in legislation or even policy, is really, really important. The other point I wanted to make is I have no doubt that these issues can be fairly easily fixed, actually, with a bit of effort and focus. The 2008 Planning Act regime for most national infrastructure projects has worked really well, and is much better than the various regimes it replaced, and it's given consent to a whole variety of projects now being built, like Tideway Tunnel in London, Tilbury 2, a new port on the Thames, now open. And that was consented in remarkable timescale. Hinkley Point C, and I could go on, a whole variety of projects that would have taken much longer. I think it's fair to say we will never know, but I think they would have taken much longer under the old regime. So it's worked well and will carry on working well. It just needs a bit of a reset or a reboot for the next decade, I think, to a few adjustments and tweaks to carry on working. And I think, therefore, that that is absolutely my view. There will always be a need for the very biggest projects to go through Parliament via hybrid bills, as Daniel's mentioned. I think their government could usefully just re-examine its resourcing of hybrid bill projects. They've been railways in the last 10, 15 years mainly, and there is no rule that you can only have one hybrid bill at a time, and yet that is seen as being a rule, both in terms of resourcing within government and resourcing within Parliament. So I think that should be reconsidered, because they can be very effective. We've got HS2 phase 2B coming along. We've got Northern Powerhouse Rail and the whole connection across the north also to be considered, possibly for a hybrid bill. And you will always have these different regimes dealing with different things. The main one is the Planning Act regime, but you will always need hybrid bills and other forms of authorising process for different types of projects. But they all just need, I think, those sort of tweaks I've mentioned to give them all that regain certainty, which I think we really need.
Thanks, Robbie. Hannah, just turning to you, how does the industry address the concerns of those who are already lining up to criticise any thought of changing the planning process? There's talk of, a democratic deficit, trampling over local democracy, people not having a say. How do we ensure that we, as far as we possibly can, of course, it maybe won't always be the case that you can do it, but how can we take people with us when we're talking about developing projects that are actually going to transform people's lives if they're gotten right?
Yeah, so no, I think that's a really good question, Andy. Something that struck me with what Daniel was saying around, MPs' resistance to wanting to sit in committees to work through a hybrid bill process was actually, to my mind, that sounds an awful lot like practical MPs championing levelling up, taking an interest in what was happening locally, where it's something that is significant to that, to that particular locality. Surely you can't get any closer to levelling up and being hands-on with it than that. But anyway, that's an aside. But I mean, I think it is something along those lines, in that, something which, again, as a non-professional in the planning world, is quite obvious to me, is it's not clear to the outside world and to communities that actually, maybe it's not clear because that's not how it's applied, that there is a risk-based approach here. If you've got something which is big and complex and scary and likely to have a high impact, high risk, put it through the hybrid bill process. Actually, by and large, for the rest of the developments, what we need to focus on are these, national policy statements. And actually, I was taken, Sean, with what you were saying about there are opportunities to do things differently to how it's done in Europe, but building on that strong basis of, the underlying ethos is to protect habitats. But again, within that, you talked about strategic priorities and the certainty of strategic priorities. That's the conversation we need to have, because if we've got that, and say, from the industry's perspective, that is another element of kind of grey area, not quite sure how we mitigate that, and then you run into a plethora of different mitigations on a scheme by scheme basis that aren't consistent, and perhaps, as you say, because of resourcing, because of timeframes, they're not getting a consistent steer, a consistent view from the planning officials. So I think there is an element of, recognise that some things are complex and high risk, and maybe ring fence those for hybrid bill process, leaning on the MPs to really do what they've been elected to do in that space. But actually, as far as industry is concerned, if you were to set that out and then set out a bigger strategic conversation about how we get the national policy statements right, that gave both certainty to which infrastructure should go ahead and how, in terms of being cognizant of the right priorities for the environment and for habitats, I think that's a huge step forward for us, because that gives the framework then for more consistent, perhaps lighter touch application of it, because you've already, if you like, made the set the principles out, made the headline rules. And as far as industry is concerned, that that would be a fantastic place to be, and that's somewhere where perhaps we certainly haven't seen the government in recent years. And yeah, maybe we are needing to just reinvent this to make it fit for what we need going forward. So perhaps, I don't know, it's a strange debate when we're almost all slightly violently agreeing.
Sean, you want to come back on something? I'm gonna let Sean and Robbie come back, and then I'm going to pose a question that will hopefully wrap things up. We will obviously return to this issue. It's a massive issue and one that we can't possibly do justice to, within 70 minutes. But anyway, Sean.
Well, just very quickly on the bills, it just strikes me that we've got the HS2 has been through a hybrid bill process. It's got cross-party support. It's got a massive support in Parliament. There's still uncertainty, and likewise Heathrow, that went through Parliament. So I think trying to get certainty is illusory in a way when it comes to really big infrastructure, because now people are saying, well, we're running out of money, can we afford HS2, and there's the climate change concerns about Heathrow. So I wouldn't search for absolute certainty. I think you can search for greater certainty, and all the points made about the NPSs. What needs to end really is Project Sloth, all the departments taking their time to update the NPSs to make them net zero compliant. That I agree would be very helpful.
Robbie?
Well, compared to many other projects, Sean, I think I would argue you have had and have relative certainty in relation to HS2, because there have been a few judicial reviews recently. But as with Crossrail, phase 1 of HS2 has been through Parliament, phase 2A is going, and legally in the planning context, the result is pretty solid certainty because it's been approved by Parliament. Heathrow is different because what was approved by Parliament was the national policy statement, not the subsequent consent for the Heathrow scheme. And the national policy statement was then judicially reviewed. And even though the NPS was approved by Parliament, and I do think as part of the current review of judicial review that government announced on Friday of last week, they should consider whether it's appropriate for national policy statements, having been consulted on and then approved by Parliament, still then to be able to be judicially reviewed. So I think that should be done. But the other point I wanted to make, again, responding to what Hannah said, was that there is some logic, I think, in what we've suggested about a super MPS, because there's a golden thread here, and it's intended to be logical and agile in terms of starting off with the evidence-based assessment work the National Infrastructure Commission has done in this once a Parliament national assessment. So that's the basis for the government then turning that into a national infrastructure strategy, using the evidence that the Commission have brought together and produced in its assessment. And then the government, the concept goes, converts that national infrastructure strategy, insofar as planning issues are concerned, into the super MPS. And it seems to me to be entirely logical to do that every 5 years, rather than have a completely separate way of producing and updating national policy statements that's almost removed from this process we now have, once the NIC was set up a few years ago, of a once in a Parliament review of our infrastructure needs. Whether we're ready this autumn to do that because of COVID-19 is another matter.
Thanks, Robbie. Just to start to draw some of the threads together, I mean, obviously what's hit the headlines today is the government's overarching review. Well, maybe not so overarching, actually. A lot of the things that are hitting the headlines are stuff around housing and basically making sure that people can get on the property ladder and all the rest of it. But clearly, this issue of planning is on the government's agenda. So given that in mind, where do our panelists think that the direction of travel is headed on this? Do you think there is a real opportunity to actually get some of these big ticket national infrastructure issues addressed? And how do you think the industry should be you know, those that represent the industry, how do you think the industry should be actually approaching government on these particular issues? You know, is there going to be a real desire, do you think, for there to be some meaningful change that's actually going to make a difference? And if I can ask Daniel for his observations on that first, Daniel.
Yes, I do think that there is a meaningful intention on the government's part to make quite radical changes. And in a way, it's a little bit of a disappointment that the consultation announced today doesn't reach to include infrastructure in the and address the issues that we are talking about. I'm just very much hoping now that ministers and civil servants don't feel that they've done planning and they can go on holiday. This needs to be addressed just as urgently as the issues to do with housing and development and the things you actually see above ground. So that, but I think they're willing to do it. It just needs to be brought home to them the whole time that there are real issues and that they can't expect to deliver a build agenda as far as infrastructure is concerned without addressing them. So I think there is a real appetite. What should the industry be doing? I think the key thing for the industry to do is, if I may, and I hesitate to advise, and Hannah can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it's to keep emphasizing this point about, I wouldn't call it uncertainty, I'd call it risk. The government sort of responds to this a little bit better than simply, oh, we can all live with uncertainty. But actually, if a business goes and says, you are enhancing the risk in this project, and as a result of that, you are driving away potential tenderers for the work, and you are increasing the costs to the public purse by doing that. Delay in itself is a cost, but the tender prices also have to price in greater levels of uncertainty. So if you want not just faster, but cheaper built infrastructure, and we do have, for reasons nobody quite understands, but surveys show higher costs in this country to deliver infrastructure than in many other comparable countries. If the industry were to focus on this question of risk and delay feeding through into cost to the public purse, which I think is a perfectly legitimate thing for them to say, they would get ministers' ears, and they would get the ears of 10 Downing Street as well.
Thanks, Daniel. Robbie, what's your gut feeling on whether or not we're going to see some real change in this area? You said in the article that you wrote for Infrastructure Intelligence that you thought that Whitehall seemed almost institutionally incapable of delivering on some of these big ticket infrastructure NPS issues. What's your view on this?
Well, I think certainly the last couple of years of government's not been a happy one with slim majorities and Brexit issues and all of that. I think my sense now is we are seeing an encouraging move away from this lip service, but it was still a block to localism that we saw governments of the last 10 years really sort of wanting to adhere to, but not really. And if you look at the consultation paper this morning that was released, we see national design codes, national planning policy, in effect replacing local planning policy when it comes to how you judge individual housing schemes and other development projects. You're seeing a national infrastructure contributions levy being proposed. You're seeing a question about should the national infrastructure planning regime be available for large housing, large new settlements. So I think you're seeing a move to dealing with things on a England basis, and that's why I am hopeful that the super NPS idea may gain traction, as opposed to just having a rather incoherent suite of NPSs that come forward at different times. So I'm encouraged actually, and I think certainly government are intending to do things differently. And I was looking back at some emails only yesterday about planning changes made in terms of personnel last year, people commenting, well, this means that real change is coming. And I think we've now seen that this morning, really. I think what industry should do, I agree what's been said by Daniel, and of course, the emphasis on risk also means that that will deter investment in projects to actually pay for the money you need to bring them forward and get consent, get permission. And even a fairly small national infrastructure scheme, you're talking about 15, 20 million pounds needed actually just to get permission for it. That requires big investment, self-evidently, and government needs to, I think, be reminded of that, and that it's absolutely crucial that confidence and certainty is regained to help bring that investment forward again.
Yes.
Thanks, Robbie. Sean, just your views on, I mentioned earlier about the need, for the industry to actually, take people with it, and then also, frankly, society needs to ensure that it has public support, for some of these big ticket and not so big ticket infrastructure projects, and indeed, the government's own mantra talks about faster, greener, better. How do we ensure? And how will your organisation be looking to ensure that the government is held to that pledge to be greener going forward?
It's a tricky one, isn't it? I think you need more consistency coming from the government on this, not that it sometimes seems an afterthought. And not always. I agree that some of the stuff in the white paper is positive and has taken account of debates in recent years. But I certainly think there needs to be an absolute commitment that new major infrastructure is net zero compliant. And what is proposed in the Environment Bill, which is net gain for development of new housing and so on, should also apply to major infrastructure. So there should be net environmental gain and gain for nature from any new major infrastructure projects. And having an absolute commitment to that would help. Ending the kind of silly talk about China speed planning and so on. I mean, that was Liz Truss, he's not in charge of planning, but you get this sort of sense of overwhelming impatience with community concerns and environmental concerns, the newt counting delays, rhetoric, all that stuff makes it harder to have a constructive conversation about what should be in everybody's interest, which is having good green infrastructure which works well for the country, increases prosperity and delivers a net gain for nature. Nothing not to like about that. And the point that's been made again and again, but the government needs to stop sort of dodging decisions on things like the National Infrastructure Strategy. These are difficult decisions, and the government needs to kind of stop the delays. And the last point, which is slightly irrelevant, Andy, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I have all the answers in my book, How to Build Houses and Save the Countryside, which will give you a unique insight into how we've got everything wrong in recent years and how we can get things right. Available from all good bookshops.
Thank you, Sean, and Amazon as well as good bookshops as well, I gather. So go out and buy that. Hannah, just to conclude,
or you could even go to a bookshop that pays its taxes, like that. Blackwell. Up to you.
That's a separate discussion altogether, I think, and far beyond our remit for this discussion. But Hannah, just concluding with you, it's interesting there. Sean mentioned the National Infrastructure Strategy. And I'm thinking about, the National Infrastructure Commission is obviously very influential in all of this stuff. Is it being listened to sufficiently closely enough? And maybe in your sort of closing remarks, maybe comment on, what you think their role in all of this should be.
Yeah, no, it's fair, Andy. I think it's an interesting challenge because they're still not on their statutory footing. So influential, but still probably mindful of how well they're received in government, which is part of the challenge, I would suspect, that Sir John Armitt's facing at the moment. So yes, I mean, what can they do? I mean, first I wanted to just, I couldn't, Daniel, I couldn't let you say that about my industry without coming back that we're always more expensive. I'll leave this as a closing remark, but having benchmarks my members' costs, fees against those across Europe, we are comparable. So I think that does speak to the space we find ourselves in with this increased risk with the process, be it planning or be it procurement, that is putting us in that situation because we are comparable in our costs. I really liked that opportunity to talk about risk. And I guess that's where the NIC can come in, is they can help us mitigate that risk. I've got a bit of a quandary at the moment in terms of how I take this forward. So I'm going to go forward and sort of lobby on this under the banner of the Construction Leadership Council. The challenge that I have, and I don't have an answer and don't expect an answer to this just yet, is I fully support Robbie's proposal for the super policy, national policy statements. I guess my fear is that we don't know what we want yet. And in part because the National Infrastructure Commission did their assessment 2 years ago. They've been waiting now for the government to actually publish a response to it. A lot has changed in that time, not least in the last few months. we need to get to the bottom of that. You know, if I was back in Treasury, I would be asking John Armitt to refresh the national infrastructure assessment, and then off the back of that, commit to putting in place the national infrastructure strategy in parallel with the supranational policy statement within the next 12 months. That's, I think, where we need to get to. We don't want to rush out a national infrastructure strategy in the autumn that, as Daniel put it, doesn't reduce the risk, because actually it's full of a load of things that are very easy to challenge through any of the planning processes we put in place, because they're not what the country needs. I think that is the bigger risk that we need to deal with. But setting that aside, we'll be fully getting behind Robbie and his supranational policy statements. The national infrastructure strategy, you know, I'm going to pick up with John Armitt about this and really what we can do to work that through sensibly. There's an offer here to be made from the industry around confidence in delivery on that. And lastly, just a charter on the you know, on the consultation process. So it doesn't have to be faster, it just has to be certain. And although simple, that would have a huge impact as far as the industry is concerned. So those are my current areas of thinking, obviously not fully attributable yet, but we shall see how that develops over the coming months. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks to all of our speakers. By necessity, it's been the beginning of a conversation on this crucial issue, and I think there's a number of key messages, even at this earlier stage, that we could actually put out there for further discussion. I think I'm minded of what Daniel said about, you know, it's good and it's great, and I think everybody recognises it's a positive step that we've actually got planning on the national agenda. But as Daniel eloquently said, you know, the civil servants and ministers shouldn't think that they've done planning now, and if they've got any holidays arranged, then maybe they ought to rethink them in order to do a little bit more investigation of the issue. And clearly as well, the key role going forward for the National Infrastructure Commission, we've obviously seen in the last few months with the COVID crisis how quickly things can change, and there probably does need to be some kind of a pause, but not for long, in order to reassess where we need to go in terms of the nation's infrastructure needs. As I say, this is a discussion and an issue that will run, and we'll ensure that we cover it to the best extent that we can in infrastructure intelligence. I just want to thank everybody for their time and their input today, to Sean Spears, to Robbie Owen, to Daniel Moylan, and to Hannah Vickers. And just keep an eye on infrastructure intelligence as we explore more on this very, very important issue of infrastructure and planning. Thanks very much for watching, and we hope to see you soon.